So I'm going to start with one of my favorite directors of all time, David Lean. If there was one director who I'd probably have to say is my absolute favorite director of all time, it would be David Lean. And the interesting thing is that most people today haven't really heard of David Lean. He was an inspiration for so many great directors today. Steven Spielberg comes to mind. I know that he idolized David Lean very much. He was very much inspired by Lawrence of Arabia. And that's actually the first movie I'd like to talk about, Lawrence of Arabia by David Lean. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Adam Kiss Show. And today I have a really great show in store for you. I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which are my favorite films. And it's a fun topic for me, especially because this list changes from day to day. You could ask me what my favorite movies are today, and I'll probably give you a slightly different list tomorrow or the next day, or 6 months from now, or 6 months ago. So it's a list that's constantly evolving, and that's why I didn't really think about this before recording this video, and I'm just going to go through a bunch of films that I love in sort of a stream of consciousness in no particular order. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite directors of all time, David Lean. If there was one director who I'd probably have to say is my absolute favorite director of all time, it would be David Lean. And the interesting thing is that most people today haven't really heard of David Lean. He was an inspiration for so many great directors today. Steven Spielberg comes to mind. I know that he idolized David Lean very much. He was very much inspired by Lawrence of Arabia. And that's actually the first movie I'd like to talk about, Lawrence of Arabia by David Lean. This was in the 60s, starring Peter O'Toole and Omar Sharif. It's really an incredible movie, and when you look at it, you can't imagine how well it's aged. It's absolutely incredible images. They shot it in the desert in Arabia for 6 months, I think, at least 6 months there, and the production, I think, honestly went over a year. And that was just, the crew was camping out in the desert sometimes for weeks at a time, everyone together. And that was before, Wi-Fi and technology, so you can only imagine the conditions there. And they really had to be passionate about making it great. Now, what makes this movie great? Well, let me think. It has an incredible story. So it does have a big story. It's about T.E. Lawrence, the author of The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, on which this book is based. The screenplay was written by Robert Bolt, I believe, very much a David Lean collaborator, incredible screenwriter. And that's the thing, David Lean loved to work with the same people. He worked with Maurice Jarre as the composer for Lawrence, for Dr. Zhivago, Ryan's Daughter, A Passage to India, and those were, I believe, his last 4 films. And the same thing with Robert Bolt. I believe he worked definitely on Lawrence and definitely on Ryan's Daughter, I know. I'm not sure about Passage to India, but I believe David Lean himself wrote the screenplay for that, or he adapted the book from the book to the screenplay. So, Lawrence of Arabia, absolutely incredible film. Another David Lean film, which I briefly mentioned, I believe, is Dr. Zhivago. Dr. Zhivago was definitely my favorite David Lean film growing up as a kid. It was a big inspiration to me. I absolutely loved just the cinematography to start, those vivid colors, those larger-than-life colors that he uses. I mean, David Lean, let's put it this way. Later in life, he opted to do these big epics, but that wasn't always the case. Earlier in his life, he did a lot of small movies. He actually started as an editor, and then he worked his way up, which is, you don't always hear of editors becoming directors. You hear of, obviously, actors becoming directors, or, an assistant director, or maybe somebody else. But for some reason, because editors are so involved in post-production, and it's such a solitary job, and a director is, has to communicate so much, that usually I would say that editors don't become directors, though directors sometimes do edit, or they obviously assist with editing their own works. But my point is, Dr. Zhivago is a story of the Russian Revolution. Ironically enough, it was filmed in Spain. A lot of the scenes with snow were fake snow and in Spain, and everyone was in heavy coats. In addition to that, one great thing about it is that although it's about the Russian Revolution, that's the time period it was set in, it's not really about the Russian Revolution. You don't have to know about history or even be interested in history. It's really about individual people and the way that history affects their lives. You don't see the grand scale of the Russian Revolution. You don't hear what Trotsky and Stalin and Lenin are saying. You don't get to hear them. It's all about the little people, or varying levels of people in that world. It's really an intricate web. I absolutely love it. Couldn't recommend it enough. And honestly, I love so many other David Lean films. Bridge on the River Kwai comes to mind, which was made right before Lawrence of Arabia. Also, Ryan's Daughter. Very controversial one, because at the time it was universally panned. The critics hated it. It even discouraged Lean from making another film for, I believe, 14 years before he made his last film, A Passage to India, which is also, I think, an underrated film. Those two last films don't get enough credit. And he was actually going to make one final film called Nostromo before he died. And I believe it was about 2 weeks before production when he died. And that movie actually never ended up getting made. Probably because by that point in history, epics were becoming fewer and far between. And if he wasn't going to make it, there was nobody else really interested in making such a grand scale project. Okay, so that was David Lean. Now I'll go back to Casablanca. Absolute classic film. One of my favorites, hands down, any day of the week. I totally love this film. I really can't imagine a world without it. It's starring Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, directed by Michael Curtiz. Interesting bit of trivia there is actually that Michael Curtiz was from Hungary. He was a Hungarian immigrant, and he barely spoke English, even though he made so many. He was a prolific Hollywood director. I remember that Errol Flynn and David Niven mentioned in several interviews how there was several difficulties because he really spoke very broken English. I believe, David Niven, he had a funny story about that, which you can look up. But other than that, just Casablanca is one of those situations where everything came together perfectly. And you can't really make a movie like that. You can try, but a movie like that almost has to happen by accident. Everything has to come together perfectly. Like, you can have the greatest director in the world, the greatest script in the world, but maybe the crew doesn't see the vision, the crew isn't really working at it, it's the wrong actors for the part, then the movie just won't work. But sometimes just everything can come together, and we know those few movies that are almost perfect. I hesitate to say perfect because I'm not interested in a perfect movie. I mean, I think that would be the most boring movie I've ever seen if it was perfect. So I love movies with flaws. Every movie should have flaws. And Casablanca is one of those where if there's a movie that almost doesn't have any flaws, that would be it. I mean, the writing is great, the directing is great, the acting is great. It's just an overall great story. It's an emotional story. It has a lot of twists and turns, but it's all warranted. Nothing's out of place. So I just absolutely love that movie. Another one would have to be Citizen Kane. It was the first film directed by Orson Welles. Absolutely great director, a great actor as well. And he did it when he was 26 years old. So it's funny, I think he always mentioned later in life that it's hard that he had to start at the top. He made probably his best movie as the first movie of his career, and then it was all downhill from there. Though I'm obviously a big Welles fan, I love so many of his works, both his directorial efforts and movies that he just acted in. There's funny stories that Welles was an absolutely workaholic when it came to directing his own films. And when it came to films that other people directed, they had somewhat of a harder time with him. Like, for example, in The Third Man, I believe that Carol Reed's hands were actually the hands that reached up from the sewer grate at the end, not Orson Welles. He wasn't on set that day. But that's another great movie, The Third Man. That's directed by Carol Reed. It was actually filmed in Vienna in the post-war period, so you can see all those demolished buildings around. It's really the quintessential film noir. Kind of a very bleak story. It has all these tilted Dutch angles with the camera work. It really gives this unsettling feeling to the story. And Joseph Cotten, Welles' good friend, actually starred in that. And although Welles is the third man in the movie, he only appears about an hour and 9 minutes in or so. So definitely past the halfway point in the movie. And he has very little screen time, but it really makes a deep impact. At least I believe so. All right, let's talk about another director, Alfred Hitchcock. Now, when you think of cinema, so many people bring up the name Alfred Hitchcock. He's an absolute legend, and I think rightfully so. I've heard a lot of interviews of people, putting him down or bringing his influence down, and I could not disagree more. I think Hitchcock is an absolute master of cinema. He's done so many different types of movies. He's also done very similar movies. He has his own style, but he's stretched it to the limits, I would say. He loves to do suspense movies, and I know he makes a very big distinction between suspense and horror, a bit suspense and mystery. He did not like the word mystery because he believed that when you're watching a movie and you don't know what's going on at all, that's wasted screen time. He believed that in the principle of the bomb under the table. So if a bunch of people are sitting around the table talking about baseball, and then suddenly a bomb explodes and blows everything up, you have a few seconds of shock. Whereas if you show the audience that there's a bomb under the table, but the people don't know it, and then they're talking about the same thing, baseball, suddenly that conversation becomes very interesting and the audience is on edge. So again, he believed in giving the audience slightly more information than the characters in the film have. Now, in a movie by Northwest, that was very hard to do because Cary Grant is literally in basically every scene. The film is almost like a noir detective film in that matter, that we see it through Cary Grant's perspective the whole way through. Having said that, there is one key scene in the film where Hitchcock decided to show other characters actually explaining what's going on and adding to the suspense. And that's a conversation that Cary Grant as Roger Thornhill did not see in the film. So that was very much Hitchcock's belief, that build suspense as opposed to mystery. You can have mystery mixed in, but without suspense, it's not as suspenseful, to be honest. Vertigo is totally different from North by Northwest, and I believe it was the film that he shot right before. It's much more, whereas North by Northwest is an absolutely incredible film. I mean, basically the James Bond producers took inspiration for North by Northwest for the early Bond movies. Some people call North by Northwest the first James Bond movie. And it's very true. I mean, Cary Grant was the first person offered the role of James Bond by Cubby Broccoli, and he turned it down. And so cinematic history was made. But Vertigo, on the other hand, very interesting movie with Jimmy Stewart. And it's a very emotional movie about a detective, and it has a lot of mystery in the beginning. And again, there's this key scene towards the middle of the film where Hitchcock reveals the mystery to the audience, but not to Jimmy Stewart. And so it's not about the mystery, it's about when will Jimmy Stewart find this out, will he find this out, what's going to happen, and it's really all about that. So as far as Hitchcock, North by Northwest, I love Vertigo. I love The 39 Steps, which is another one that not many people know. And I love To Catch a Thief. I love Suspicion, also with Cary Grant. Very interesting film with an ending that I believe Hitchcock went back and forth with how he should end it. I don't want to spoil it, but there's definitely some nuance in the way he ended that film, which I believe is a great thing when an ending can be slightly ambiguous. Because I believe that it's better when an audience can interpret things for themselves, when an audience can be included and use their own imagination. I think that's really the best the best thing that can be. Another one of my favorite directors is Ingmar Bergman, not to be confused with Ingrid Bergman, but he was a Swedish director. I discovered him really. I saw my first Bergman movie a long time ago, but I really discovered him in earnest just 3 or 4 years ago. Going back and watching a bunch of his stuff. And it's really, he directs in very much my style, I think, in a certain way. It's very toned down stories, very, very contained stories. He was the screenwriter as well. And it's all about the characters in these situations, like Smiles of a Summer Night, one of my favorite movies, and it was one of his attempts at something of a comedy, though I wouldn't call it a full comedy by any means. But it's a little bit of everything. It is drama, it's satire, it's comedy. It's kind of about the whole human condition and human behavior. My favorite Bergman movie would have to be The Seventh Seal, I would say. It's about a knight returning from the Crusades back home. And it's about, the plague was happening at that time. And there's a lot of symbolism that he's playing chess with death and throughout the movie, and He's also traveling along the countryside, and it's just an incredible movie. It's deeply symbolic. I absolutely love it. And Wild Strawberries as well, another one of his movies that I love. These are all in black and white, which I think, honestly, for these stories, for Bergman, I would say I prefer black and white, though for many directors, I absolutely love them in color, obviously. I can't imagine, it's hard to imagine someone like David Lean not in color. Now, having said that, a lot of his earlier films with Noel Coward, for example, his collaborations like Brief Encounter, which is also one of my favorite Lean movies, that's in black and white. But he really evolved later on, whereas Bergman, I think, his type of story was perfect in black and white. Yeah, as I mentioned, Wild Strawberries, another great Bergman movie, very emotional as well. And I just love it. It's about an old man really remembering his life, and as he's going on a trip in real life. So again, I can't do it justice by mentioning it like that. All of these movies really were an inspiration for me in my feature film, My Last Words, which we just finished filming roughly 2 months ago. I took inspiration from all of these great directors, all of these great films, and there's so many more that I haven't got to today, and I'll probably get to in another episode of the Adam Kiss Show. But as I was filming, in my head, I'm always thinking of living up to this and more, living up to these great examples and adding my own personal spin. Because again, I don't believe in just emulating, great directors or great films in the past. I believe you have to add something new. You have to see it in a new way. And obviously, I wrote the script for this movie. I already had a vision of how it was going to be shot. So just by that, I'm doing my own unique thing. If you've noticed, most of these directors are from the past, and I definitely love movies from the past so much more than most movies today. I think that's just my preference, I would say. I love the style of storytelling, and some people would say those movies were more restricted. I would say that restriction actually helped them to be better because they were forced to be more creative, the writers, directors, everyone. For example, I've heard people criticizing Hitchcock that he didn't go far enough and that some of the people after him who went further than him and who sort of emulated him, like Brian De Palma. Some people would argue that they preferred his work. I would say that I preferred Hitchcock precisely because he couldn't show all of the gruesome stuff. It was left more to your imagination. And I think that the imagination is way more powerful. You shouldn't show everything on screen. I mean, if you show everything on screen, in my opinion, that's a total waste. Certain things should be left to the audience's interpretation. And this can vary by film. Certain films need more shown, certain need less. But just generally, that's what I feel. Anyway, that's all we have time for today. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Adam Kiss Show, and I'll be talking more on future episodes about some more of my favorite films, as well as anything to do with filmmaking, art, or even just life. And I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to follow my social media accounts on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, etc., etc., etc. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great day.